Hopefully, can everyone hear me? I muted mine, so now we should be good.
Keep mine on.
So.
And then
You should add that.
so it's not right now and I'm talking.
Yeah, because I was,
Okay, that should be good.
yeah, because I muted my speakers.
Got it.
Yeah.
Can you hear us now online?
You're good.
You hear us online? Oh, yeah, they said you're good. You're good.
Fabulous.
Awesome.
Wally says, audio.
Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things before we really jump in. My name's Matt Osbun. I work for a company called Applied Information Sciences. We are a Microsoft Gold partner, and we specialize in leading edge in Azure. We get access to a lot of the new services before they're publicly available, new programs, and our real focus is getting people into Azure as efficiently as possible. We understand that the cloud can be expensive. One of our goals is to get you what you need and nothing else so that you're not wasting your money on it, but still getting a solution that's going to work for you. I do a fair amount of things there. My actual job title is, what is it these days? I think Cloud Solutions Architect or something along those lines. And lately, I have been getting involved in our domain-driven design practice. And I have discovered several pitfalls in the way this tends to get delivered. And what I want to talk about today is ways to get an enterprise with either very immature DDD practices or none whatsoever up and running as efficiently as possible so that you have a good chance of growing this. And as any of you who have seen me present before, you realize I absolutely hate PowerPoint and will not use it, but I can't exactly give this one today without some form of visuals. So at some point I will begin sharing my screen, but I want to go over a few things first. So you're always supposed to start one of these things with a joke. So what is the best way to eat an elephant?
What?
Oh, come on. This thing's older than I am.
Bits and pieces.
One bite at a time. I tell this strictly as an icebreaker and not something that will have any relevance on the presentation going forward.
There will be.
Yes, there will be.
This is BYTE,
So,
right?
Every insurance company and mortgage lender that I've ever seen, and probably all of them in the world, have one interesting thing in common. Well, interesting to me at any rate. They have this concept called a risk rating system. And what it does is simply, in practice, although not in execution, what it does is say, given this mortgage application or loan application or insurance application, how much risk are we taking on accepting this? This is the lifeblood of any of these companies. Take on too much risk, and we're back in the days of the housing bubble. Everybody goes under. Take on too little risk, and first of all, you run into regulatory problems, and you shut yourself out of revenue that you could have had if you were willing to be a little riskier. These things are very important, and while they will have certain things in common, looking at actuarial tables, etc., they're also fairly domain specific. And they all have two things in common, at least again, all the ones that I've seen. Number one, no single individual in the enterprise knows how they work. Number two, no single person or development team or architect in the IT department knows how the tech stack works. So if you are on one of these teams, updating one of these systems, you are by default, practically by design, working with incomplete information, or even worse, bad information. And what happens when you start a project with bad information and incomplete information? Well, in Christopher Columbus's case, he takes off for India, not knowing that there are a couple of inconveniently large continents in his way, ends up making landfall somewhere that is definitely not India and not even in the right part of the world, and declares victory. And while you're sitting there thinking, yeah, well, that was one of the more spectacular screw ups in history, I'd ask how many people have been part of a project where, because of information problems, you ended up delivering the wrong thing that wasn't useful to anybody. But it might be just as easy to say, everybody raise their hand, because everybody's been a part of that.
Yeah.
And the reason for this is we force development and the business to work independently of each other. And while no single person on the business knows everything about a risk rating system, you can find a subset of the business that knows everything there is to know about it. Just like you can find in your IT department a group of people that know everything about the tech stack for it. What domain-driven design tries to do at its core is bring those groups together so that we have a better picture of what we need to do going forward. There's a lot more to it, but at the core, it's get the right people in a room to map this out so that we don't have to do it another couple hundred times. Now, there are, like I said, there's a lot to domain-driven design. We are not going to go over all of it. I want to do two things here. Number one, get something that will get an enterprise started. There are some pitfalls to getting this sort of thing in place. We'll hopefully have time at the end to discuss what those are and how to deal with them. But the other thing is domain-driven design ends up with a lot of artifacts. Most of them get tucked away in a wiki somewhere and you never see them again, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a waste of time. And the only thing I hate worse than wasting time is bad coffee. So the other thing I want to do is show how to produce artifacts that work, that do something for you, that you will look at again and use. And not just the developers, but everybody in the project will have something that they can look at in these artifacts and say, this is how I do my job. Now, there are a couple of flavors of domain-driven design. Around the office, we bandy about the terms strategic and tactical domain-driven design. And as the names probably communicate, with strategic, you start with the big picture and you get a general idea of what your business domain is, where the service boundaries would be, things like that. And as you develop within it, you then refine from there because you can't do it all at once. Kind of like eating an elephant. See what I did there? This is actually a good practice and the way I would recommend doing it, but this only works in two situations. Number one, when you already have a mature domain-driven design practice and you're used to it. Number two, when the facilitator, the guy running the show, has tight communication with upper leadership who is committed to doing this and stays that way. And I'm not saying that never happens, but I'm saying that is risky enough that when we're starting new, I like to start with the tactical and build up. And it gets you to the same place, whether you start small and build up until you have a map of your entire domain, or you start big and start refining, you end up in the same place. But if you start small, something interesting happens. Domain-driven design has a lot of meetings in it. This is necessary. And in an organization that is not used to this and is still defining progress as code written, code in the repo, code released to production, they can look at these meetings and go, there's no progress. What are we doing here? We've got deadlines to meet. We've done our PI planning and pretended we can map out the next 6 months worth of development. You're throwing everybody behind. If we start with the tactical, we can get code out there very quickly so that while we are showing a new way to measure progress, we are still contributing to the old way of measuring progress. And in my opinion and experience, that gets you going better.
So, sorry. Could you please? Don't think they have missed something. They think you're onto your slide, but you're not.
Nope.
Sorry, guys. You have a lot of info.
I don't do slides. We will get to the pictures later. So. Sorry, lost my train of thought. Okay, so. It is very difficult to talk about domain-driven design without specifics. You can talk generalities. It's not going to really sink home. So we're going to dig into a specific real use case. I've already done the work, broken it down on my own because I was writing a presentation here. When you do it for real, you need two things. First of all, you need everybody who knows about the problem domain, or at least a representation from that group. If you are in one of those situations where somebody says, well, our developers know the domain well enough, you don't. Don't get me wrong. Yes, you know many things about the domain. I'm not trying to slight you on that one. Douglas Adams pointed out in the early 90s that if you can break something down into small enough bits for something as stupid as a computer to understand, then you learn about it yourself. It's true. However, we have a different point of view than the business does. We know what's on paper, the paper that we've been given. They know what they actually have to do. They know the little shortcuts that they take. An example I like to give. Man gets wheeled into the emergency room. Unconscious, does not have ID on. Now the hospital, hopefully, isn't going to leave him on the doorstep until he wakes up on his own, because he's not going to. They got to do something. In all likelihood, part of that something is going to be some sort of medication. So in order to log this patient into an emergency room system, you obviously can't require a name because you might not get one. However, by law and by common sense, for a prescription, you gotta have a name. How do we meet these two up? I tell you exactly how you do that. You ask the business, what do you do in that situation? And then do that, because they already know. The intake people, the nurses, the doctors, they already know what you do in that situation. But if you're taking an IT point of view, you're thinking about, is this field nullable? Is this field mandatory? You got to have both sides in there in order to actually get the information you need. So we're going to jump into a real world scenario that I encountered a long time ago at a mortgage company. Yes, Ari, that mortgage company.
It's called that mortgage company?
Well, doesn't have its own name anymore. So
We don't talk about it.
the use case, so when I say we're going to start small, I mean we're going to start really small. I recommend that you don't even start breaking down an application. You break down a use case, a user interaction with the system. Second thing I recommend is you start with something easy so that you can make lots of mistakes and learn from them on something that isn't difficult. And number three, you always start with the happy path, assuming everything works, which we all know is the vast minority of situations, but we'll get into why you want to start there. The interaction that we're going to start with is a prospective mortgage borrower trying to generate what's known as a mortgage disclosure. For those of you who don't know, that is the form you get at the end of the process. It's got a big number at the upper right-hand corner that tells you how much you're going to pay per month in total. Mortgage for principal, interest, insurance, taxes, kitchen sink, everything. And the reason for this is a lot of people were getting sticker shock. Okay, I've got $1,000 a month mortgage. Why am I paying $2,000 a month for this? Well, there's a lot that goes into it. So the laws changed so that they had to generate the whole thing. And I picked this one because at the time, that was not actually possible automatically. And had this company started with a domain-driven design standpoint, the pain points would have come out very quickly, and what to do about them would have become very, very obvious. So we're going to start at the very beginning, and that is a process called event storming. Event storming is by no means the most important part of this process, but it's like the foundation of a house. If you don't do this right, everything collapses. And in the old days, before everybody was remote and everything was on video, you'd get everybody into a room with a bunch of sticky notes, and everyone would grab a sticky note, write down a thing that happens during that interaction and throw it on the wall. And you would just keep grinding through that until nobody else had anything more that happens during this interaction. So that's what I've got here. You see insurance quote received, loan quotes created. It's important to keep them as past tense actions that have happened. We'll get into why in a bit. Yeah, this is, by the way, a very dumbed down version of this, partially because I don't remember all of it, and partially because you really don't want to get bored with the minutia. It's not the most interesting thing in the world. So this is a reasonable enough representation of the things that have to happen. You'll notice here the risk category assigned, credit report pulled. And I want to specifically talk about credit report pulled and property tax amount pulled. These are phrases that the business used. They never said get the credit report. They said pull the credit report. You use the language the business uses. Not because the business is going to go through your code and want to know what things are, but if the code says credit report pulled and the business knows what credit report pulled means, then you know what credit report pulled is supposed to do. You match these things up so that there is no question, and through this you build what's called a ubiquitous language. That is terms that everybody agrees on for the definition. And you write it down somewhere. I did not do that here. I suggest not, as I've seen done before, throwing everything onto one Mira board or Lucid chart, because it'll let you, but you'll lose track of where anything is very, very quickly. So somewhere you have this ubiquitous language, and it would have in there credit report pulled, and it would have a definition of the process of getting a prospective buyer's credit rating from whatever bureau you use. Next step, once everybody's kind of petered out on that and there's nothing more to do, you start refining. And I'm sorry, but these are going to get more and more busy, so I will try and zoom in. Oh, good. It's still big enough. So what we've done here is, first of all, we have refined the sticky notes. Sharp-eyed viewers will note that over here, I have financial info entered. Over here, there is no financial info entered sticky note. That's because at this place, part of the process of creating the profile was to be entering your financial information. So there's no need to record that as an event. It's part of another event. And that's part of what you're doing in this process here. If there are events that seem similar, you talk about them. Why are there two representations? Because one person didn't notice that the other one was up? Great, you pull one down. Because one person thinks that there's a slightly different way of doing this and that that's important, you talk it through. You understand what's going on until the development team and the business agrees that this is the complete representation of everything that happens. And this is where participation gets really important. You can't, it does not help if you have a bunch of people going, okay, yeah, that sounds good, whatever. You've got to have people who are willing to stand up and say, I'm not sure that's right, or that's not the way I do it, or something like that. You've got to have people willing to contribute. You also need to not have people whose only contribution is obstructing things to show how smart they think they are. I have had to deal with that in the past. It is nothing more than a waste of time. Have to have contributors, have to have people who contribute constructively, because it is very important that once you're done with this diagram, you know that that is everything this interaction does. So I want to pause here for a moment. For any Scrum Masters, project managers, BAs out there, we are dealing with an interaction of a user wants to generate a loan disclosure document. We could reword that a little bit if you like and say, as a user, I want to generate a loan disclosure document. And now we have a user story. Your interactions become your user stories. And it really is just that simple. Now, make it a user story, make it a feature, make it an epic, it doesn't matter. Domain-driven design is not telling you how to manage your project. Do it however it works for you, but you know right there, here's a work item that I've got to track, so let's start tracking it. Moving on from here, we get to the storyboard. And this is just the same thing that we saw, but now we have systems on top so that we know what is doing these things. Borrower profile comes from a form on your website. The credit report comes from an API. The loan quote comes from another API, so on and so forth. So now you know who's doing everything. From here, and this is where things start to get a little jumbled, we're still okay up there. We now start mapping the flow of information. And you'll notice each tab has been building on the last one. That's not an accident. If we do it this way, the next thing that you need to do becomes very easy to understand because it's a variation of the last thing that you did. This is also why I say you should deal with the happy path first. Can you imagine what this would look like if we had a bunch of if-then branching in there? It would quickly become unreadable. So when you map out what happens when something fails, that's a new interaction. But let's say we want to map out what happens if the property tax API either throws an error, fails to come back, or doesn't exist in the first place, which was the case when I originally dealt with this. Well, now you have your original documentation. You change this little bit here instead of generating everything from scratch. Now, the other thing I want to call out here There's a lot of the blue sticky notes are called commands. The yellow sticky notes are called events. For those of you familiar with messaging, this does not mean command messages and event messages. That is something completely different. What we want right now is something tells something else to do something, and something else does that thing. This is generally geared towards distributed systems connected by a message bus, but this works in a monolith as well, which is good because I suspect everybody who starts this for the first time is in fact going to be using it with a monolith. You could be using separate services. You could be using separate parts of your monolith. The idea still stands. Something says do this, something does that thing. The other thing I'd like to point out is when you have create borrower profile created, pull credit report. Well, these sound a lot like tasks that you need to track in order to do your user story. All right. Well, now you know what you need to put in your work item tracker underneath the original item. And you know it's complete because back here, we agreed that it's complete. We agreed that there is nothing else. This is correct and definitive because that is, we know that this is, because this is, we know that this is. Everything builds on itself and everything is accurate because the tech team is working with the business. The business is telling the tech team how the business operates. The tech team, on the other hand, well, we can see some very interesting things in here. If you'll notice coming out of loan quotes selected, we stop our one thing at a time flow, and we see that actually several things can happen in parallel once a loan quote has been selected. This sort of diagram is going to show that particular interaction, and somebody designing this system can say, yeah, all of this stuff can happen in parallel. We don't need to do this one at a time. This is also going to show you've got a credit bureau API here, you've got a quote API, a risk API, property tax, insurance. What's going to happen if you do all of this sequentially, synchronously in the same request? Yeah, you're going to end up with the worst kind of problems possible. They will be intermittent, they will be difficult to understand, and they will be difficult to solve, and they will be nearly impossible to recover from. So the architect looking at this can go, yeah, that's not going to work. We need some form of asynchronous process here. Doesn't matter what that form is. Domain-driven design is not worried about that. You use a message bus. You can use a timed process of some sort. It really doesn't matter. What this is telling you is that this cannot be one flow. Yeah, eventually that piece of information is going to come out. Now it's come out before you started writing code and backed yourself into a corner. Now, before I move to the next slide, has anybody heard of Conway's Law? Care to share? Exactly. Organizations will develop software that mirrors their lines of communication. So if you have a data team and a business rules team and a UI team, you're going to build N-tier monoliths. If you have software developers who are aligned against a business process, then you will have software that mirrors your business process front to back. For anybody who caught my last presentation, that's where you want to be. So what we are going to do from here is apply Conway's Law. Let's see if I can't get that small enough to have first everything on screen. Nope, Not really. All right, we'll just zoom in some. So what we're doing is taking the same diagram that we had, but now we're saying certain things are done by the application team. Certain things are done by the team that handles borrower services. Certain things are done by the team that handles the loan quote. This may be the same team. It may be different teams. That depends on your organization. We've got a communications swim lane here, a risk rating swim lane. In the domain-driven design world, we call these bounded contexts. And it's deliberately a very general term because what it means is what it means for you. In general, services in a bounded context should only communicate with each other through a message bus, but that's not always the way things go. The point is communication between bounded contexts should be handled very, very carefully, if at all. However, communication within a bounded context is more or less unrestricted. It does what it needs to do. The other thing about a bounded context in a perfect world is that each one gets its own database with its own copy of the data that it needs. Nothing outside the bounded context gets access to that data ever. It has to ask a service, or more accurately say, this is a thing that needs doing, go off and do it. So data should not be shared between bounded contexts. We'll refine that in a little bit. But as we go through here, we can start mapping out that, for instance, after the loan quote is selected, different bounded contexts have to do different things to react to that thing that happened. But we still have our basic sticky notes here. We still have our flow of somebody says go do something, somebody goes and does it and says I'm done here. Now, the next thing I want to get to is a hard topic, and one that I had a hard time with it in domain-driven design, and that's because a lot of examples that I've seen, books that I've read get way too deep into this. And in my opinion, you get to a lot of ivory tower style theorizing about this and not a whole bunch of practical application. And let's face it, if it isn't practically applicable, what are you doing? Sorry, forgot one thing. My apologies on that. The other thing that I want to point out about this, let me get this back up so you can see that. So we already said that these verticals that we see here are tasks that need to be accomplished. Work items that you put in your work item tracker. You take these horizontal swim lanes here, and now you know who needs to be assigned that task. Again, could all be in the same development group, could be in different ones, but when you start looking at these corners, you now have a work item that is connected to an overall work item and the team that needs to do this. Again, applicable. Your Scrum Master, your project manager, whoever handles that now has visually right in front of them what needs to be tracked and who needs to be given it. And again, you know it's definitive because every step before that was definitive. You don't have to ask, am I missing anything? Because that question's been asked and answered already. You don't have to guess if you have covered everything. You don't have to have some kind of consensus meeting to see if anybody else can think about anything else because that's all been done. Now you can take this document and turn it into your backlog. So the next step, aggregates, it's a weighty one. And there's a lot in it that gets ground over and talked about. In my opinion, a lot of those things will shake out in the end anyway with a little bit of common sense. Yes. Sorry, I had to jump back a second because I realized I'd forgotten something. Yes, there is a lot of arguing over minutia that goes on in aggregates. An aggregate, simply put, is a connected set of data and behavior. Now you'll notice this has kind of abandoned the workflow that we had created here. Is this big enough? Yes, it is. So we know in the borrower aggregate that it needs to be able to create a profile, needs to be able to get a credit report. It needs to have this set of information. Now I kind of cheated on a little bit of it because again, didn't remember all of it, didn't want to list it all out. But you know you need a bunch of borrower information. You know you need that borrower's financial information. You know you need that borrower's credit history. And with all of that information, you have a borrower profile. You have a related set of data. Now, the two things, again, in my experience, that get ground over the most is, first of all, the aggregate head, which simply put is that set of data that if deleted, everything else would need to be deleted as well. Most of that, in my experience, is pretty easy to tell and doesn't need a lot of talk over. For instance, in the borrower aggregate, you delete the borrower, you should probably delete all the other information regarding the borrower in the borrower BC, not across your enterprise. If the BC doesn't have a borrower, the BC shouldn't have the borrower financial information or the credit history. Now, other aggregates may have that. That's perfectly okay. Because of the next thing, what's known as invariance, which simply put is information that a BC has no business changing. And again, this doesn't take a lot of work to figure out. So if you have a borrower aggregate, it shouldn't be changing credit history. It should be changing borrower information. It may have a credit history associated with it, and that's fine, but that's not its data. That's somebody else's data. It doesn't change it. It just records it so that it has that information when needed, but that's projected from somewhere else. The borrower BC does not get to change that. Same with the loan quote aggregate. You'll see that a loan quote needs a borrower, obviously. But the loan quote aggregate is all about loan quotes, thus the name. So a loan quote does not get to decide to change the borrower's name or social security number or anything like that. It needs to know this information, but it doesn't get to change it. That's what an invariant is all about. And yes, that does in a way create a lot of duplicate data, sort of. So the idea of not duplicating data came from way, way, way back when doctors Boyce and Codd created the relational model and storage space was at a premium. So you didn't want to duplicate anything because a 1 megabyte drive took roughly the size of a room. It's not quite the case today, but you still don't want to go just duplicating anything. The example I give on this a lot is a purchase order. So when you have a purchase order, and I mean a sheet of paper purchase order, it's got a few things on it. It's got the name of the payer and an address likely. It's got the payee's information. It's got an itemized list of stuff that is being paid for. It's got costs on it, and it's got the PO terms on it. Of all of that information, the purchase order itself only owns the PO terms. Everything else comes from somewhere else. But you don't have a customer name on your PO. You've got the name of the person who is paying or is going to be paid through that PO, which conceptually is different information than a customer's name. Might coincidentally be the same set of characters, but it is not the same thing. Alternatively, another example I like to give is an address. You have an address for your customer. That specifically meaning the code that the post office has assigned to identify that building. You also have an address that you're shipping something to. That's a slightly different piece of information. That's not the building that your customer resides at. That's where you're sending a package. So they might, again, be the same set of characters. They mean something very, very differently. So when you are projecting data into another BC, one of the things you ask yourself is, does it mean something different in this context? If it doesn't, you're probably talking about things that should be in the same context together. But let's go back to this borrower here. This is not referring to a potential customer. It's not referring to somebody who wants to borrow money. It's referring to information that is put on the loan application. It's slightly different. Yes.
Yeah, types like that, that's fine.
Oh, it's all going to be typed somewhere. But when you're talking about saving, let's say, similar seeming pieces of data in different databases, what you're really looking for is, does this mean something a little bit different in this context? If the answer is yes, you go ahead and replicate the data. That becomes an invariant, and that BC does not get to mess with that data. It gets to read it and read it only. If, on the other hand, it seems to really be the same thing between these two contexts, it's usually a good sign that you need to go back and rethink your contexts. I don't try and make this seem easy. It is not. What it is incredibly worthwhile to the software development process. One other thing I'd like to note here, what does this look like? You've got a name up here. You've got a list of things that this aggregate can do. You've got a list of things that this aggregate knows about. Does this not look a little bit like a class diagram? Okay, well, software developers, now you know what your classes look like. All you have to do is fill in the blanks. And no, that doesn't mean you're just kind of a code monkey who does what he's told, where he's told to do it. You helped build this. You have been part of this process from the start. So when you get to this point, you have created your own class diagram, work that you were going to do anyway. All you have to do is fill in what these things actually do. And on a refrain that I am going to continue saying for one more tab, you know this is definitive because everything up to this point has been. You have a consensus, a agreement between tech and business that this is correct. You don't have to ask yourself, am I missing something? You're not. You've asked that question already. It's been answered either in no or in yes, and now we need to fill in what we've missed. The last bit I want to show is actually my favorite one. I spend a lot of time in this diagram with customers, going over it bit by bit, making sure it's correct. The enterprise sequence diagram. Oh, good. The screen's still big enough that you can see everything. We have on top here our bounded contexts. We have between them showing the flow of information through this entire interaction. We can see now at a glance with a visual right in front of us. We create a borrower profile. Once that's created, it goes to a loan quote. Loan pulls a credit report, gets that credit report back. We see where all of the information goes. We even see a couple of these where a service gets something, does something internally, and then can send that information off, or more likely raise an event saying, I have done this thing now, does anybody care? I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on sagas. This is a presentation I give in a few different scenarios, but a saga is essentially an orchestration, but an orchestration as a web service that mimics a singleton. Mimics a singleton is not a singleton. That got me in trouble a few times. But what happens in a saga is the first thing that happens when the saga is called, it goes to a data store and retrieves the last state that it was in. Then it does whatever it is you told it to do. And then once it's done, it saves its new state back to the data store so that the next time it's called, it now has a new state. Sagas have identifiers similar to database tables so that when you call a saga with an identifier, you know exactly what data you're supposed to pull. And they are very, very good for orchestrations. They are. Once you get the hang of them, it's, yeah, I mean, it was life-changing. You don't want to have them do too much. The best use for them is to have them call other things, to have other things do them so that the saga itself is kept nice and light, because you do have the added overhead of pulling and saving its state. So yes, they are slower than simply calling a normal web service. Speed is not their point. Their point is they are extremely highly scalable, and they are very good at handling race conditions. So let's say Ticketmaster, two people want to buy the same ticket at the same time, at the same concert at almost but not quite the same time, because nothing's ever really simultaneous. Saga starts up for the first one that gets through. The next one goes, nope, that ticket belongs to somebody else already. You can't have it. It makes dealing with race conditions actually fairly trivial. And what we would do in this diagram is, and we show the customer, here's how everything is flowing through your new system. Is this right? Does this meet your business rules? Do the people who actually do this thing do it in this order? And, again, you will probably have people from different business groups chiming in, but you would have somebody saying, yeah, I can't pull the credit report until I have the borrower's information. We can't run a risk report until we have this. And with all of the business people in the room, you now have the correct group of people to say either, yes, this is the correct sequence of events, or no, it is not, we need to change it. And that's actually why I spent a great deal of time in diagrams like this, because we would get to this last bit and somebody would say, well, yes, usually, but then sometimes this can happen. I'm like, okay, great. We have a new sequence of events we need to talk about. In fact, going back to this, I mentioned that this use case happened a long time ago. So this step right here, property tax API, yeah, that didn't exist. In fact, insurance API, yeah, that didn't exist either. So there was no way to completely automate this process. Now, let me give you a little bit of background here. The laws that necessitated all of this, Tilla Respa or Respatilla, I forget which one it was created in order to make the mortgage borrowing process more transparent, which is in theory a very, very good thing. It was also written by politicians, which in practice is not always such an awesome thing. In this case, it was written by politicians who had no idea what an API is, no idea about anything about software development, and didn't know that at the time, mortgage borrowing was getting automated online. They were still picturing a paper process. So this works perfectly on paper. We all know about processes that work well on paper. So had this been done, we look at this information flow. Keep in mind, we're not talking about services or anything, any sort of code construct. This is the flow through the business process. We can look at that and say, yeah, that's great, but there's no such thing as a property tax API. What do we do? And in this case, we would rework the diagram so that information gets saved, here at the loan quote selected process. Information gets saved to the database and that ends. And then somebody it would probably still call the risk API. They had one of those, but then somebody would manually look up the property tax API, the property tax information. Somebody would manually look up the insurance information. And once all of that was also saved, then the automatic disclosure process could kick off and complete properly. These laws actually forced a change in a area that, let's face it, mortgage lenders are very, very slow to change. They are highly regulated. There's a lot of risk. Changing something is usually a lot worse than not changing something. This forced a change that allowed the mortgage process to be completely automated. So on the one hand, yes, there were some very good things that came out of this set of laws that only envisioned ever doing this on paper. Had companies, and I'm sure the successful companies did something along these lines, had they laid all of this out and go, right here, we have a failure point. How do we deal with it before we start writing code? Right here, we have a failure point. What happens next? Then you can build a process that actually works. And that's why I said start with the happy path, because then you can find the failure points. And then you can do your next interaction. Property tax API fails or doesn't exist. Insurance API fails or doesn't exist. Now you have two more. If you want to get really, really detailed about it, you have a third one where both of them fail. And you keep diagramming what happens in your interaction. Yes, this takes a long time. You know what takes even longer? Fixing software you didn't build correctly in the first place. So when you do all this work, you have right in front of you in a visual fashion all of the things you need to know to do your project. The architect can look at this and go, is this correct? What do we need to change? The software developers can look at this and start practically copying and pasting their classes right here. The project manager can look at this and know what work items need to be created and who they need to be assigned to. These are practical documents. They would never be tucked away in a wiki somewhere and completely forgotten, because this is what tells you how to do your project. And once you have these documents in front of you, everything else becomes a matter of typing. You've already done all the thinking. Now, I've said that there are generally a couple of big hurdles, let's say, to getting a enterprise started on this. One of them I have mentioned a few times. This takes a long time. It really, really does. If you are facilitating this, helping run these meetings, run this process, you have got to identify the people who can tell you to stop and make sure that they always see the value that they are getting. It also helps if you have sign up from these people in the first place, but what you can do with this is start small. I was working contract in a very large insurance company that didn't do any of this by policy. It was agile fall, essentially. But what I did was on one user story, all of this. And my job as architect was pretty much to tell the software developers what they already knew. So I did all of this on one user story, showed it to people and said, here's all the information you know. Scrum Master, here's how you understand what needs to be tracked in Azure DevOps. Software developers, here are your classes. Here's how everything's going to fit together. Is this right? Big surprise, it wasn't, because I did this all by myself and did not have the correct people in there, but showed it to the correct people who then said, no, that's not right. This needs to change. Great, we changed it. Then it became right and development went smoothly. It did not convince large enterprise to change their practices, but you can only do what you can do, right? One of the things you can do is sneak something in on something small that you can handle yourself and show people the benefit of it. Now, all of a sudden, the meetings aren't useless wastes of time anymore. They are producing something that they have already seen value from. The other thing I like to point out is that the business stakeholders are part of the software development process, whether they like it or not. They might be working hand in hand with the developers to make sure everything's done right the first time. They might just be writing requirements. They might just participate in that great user acceptance testing that we call a production deployment. But one way or another, they participate in the software development process. So let's use their time wisely and efficiently. Let's take the time that they would be spending telling us how we screwed up in the first place and prevent us from screwing up in the first place. A lot of very resistant managers I've found are willing to listen when you say, let's use time wisely and efficiently, because they're worried about wasting time. Once they switch their context to using time properly, things get a lot easier. And if you're in a situation where you're dealing with a decision maker who is just saying no, even presented with that information, talk to these two over here. It might be time. The other thing that I encounter a lot is we're not going to involve the business because software development already knows the domain. Well, do you? And that's the real trick, isn't it? Do you? You know what you've built? You know what you've been told? How do you know that's everything? It was Donald Rumsfeld, at least saying it the first time I ever saw heard of this, talking about your known knowns, the stuff that you know, your known unknowns, the stuff that you know for a fact you don't know but need to go find out. And then there are those pesky unknown unknowns, the stuff that jumps up and bites you when you least expect it because you didn't see it coming. As software developers, you have a certain amount of unknown unknowns about the business process. It might be zero. It might be a lot. The problem is you don't know. How do you fill those in? You ask the people who know. I mean, it makes sense, right? You don't know something, you go ask a person who does know. That person only knows a little bit of it. You find somebody else to ask, you go ask that person. That's all we're talking about here. Everything else I've presented is just a particular way to document the answers that you get that I feel is useful in the long run. Yes. Ineffectively, I'm afraid. I absolutely took everything that I said here. I mean, this is practically word for word what I did. Look, sometimes it's not going to work. And again, my experiences, my biases here, the larger the enterprise you work in, the more resistant they are to change. If that doesn't work for you, these two. If that does work for you, then great. Don't do this. If you are in a small, lean organization that likes to try new things, that wants to get better, that likes evolving, Bring this up. Talk about, we only know what we know. We don't know what these people over here know. Talk about we can use time more efficiently. Talk about we can build and document better software. In, again, my experience in a smaller organization, that has a much better chance of landing. And in fact, where I've had the greatest successes in this were fairly small organizations where I would have at least at the start, the entire development team on the phone, all three of them. Now, by the time my participation in this project was over a year and a half later, they were not only on a hiring blitz because they realized 3 people couldn't do all of this, but they were scaling well enough that they could afford to go on a hiring blitz. And quite frankly, they didn't need me anymore because I was no longer telling them anything they didn't know. Smaller organizations, in my experience, grow and evolve extremely well in general. And I think this is where you're going to find a lot of receptiveness to ideas like this.
And it's where you work your way out of a job.
Can you also use the same time-saving argument that the first issue we talked about came up?
Yes, you can. Yes, you should. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't.
Example for it's that one?
Against wanting to keep the business and the developers separate?
Yeah.
So I would take a very specific approach on this. How much time do we have here? Because this could get lengthy. All right. So the first thing I would do is what in negotiating circles is often called a fear index. It seems to me like that the business can't be a part of this. Then, well, actually, I'd start with, I'm going to have to push on this a little bit. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but this is a conversation we need to have. Drag that fear out in the open, talk about it, make it okay to refer to. Then do your it seems. It seems like you don't want the business to be a part of this, or better yet, it seems like the business can't be a part of this. Why is that? Doesn't matter what your answer is. You come back with a question that is designed to pull information and, if worded correctly, even gets the other person to solve your problem for you. Your question should not be answerable by a yes or no. 2 reasons for this. First of all, yes can actually mean a lot of different things. It can mean, yes, I agree with you, but we're done here. It can mean, yes, I agree with you, and we're going to do what you say. And it can also mean, shut up, I'm done listening right now. No, of course, means no, which actually makes it in its own way very useful, because now you know what's out of bounds. Everything else might be in bounds. But anyway, you ask a question that can't be answered with a yes or no. How do we build better software if we can't ask the people who know the business domain best? Now the other person has to solve your problem for you. And maybe that solution is you just keep doing what we told you to do. Well, negotiating with a large enterprise doesn't always work particularly well because they can fall back on a policy that says, no, we're just not going to do that. All right. Now you know what to do from there. If we want to keep looking at this as a negotiation, a good negotiator is always willing to walk away. Maybe that's something you can do. Maybe it is not. But at the very least, you have put yourself in the best position you can to reach some sort of understanding. Maybe no understanding can be reached. These things happen sometimes. Sometimes you pay full price for a car because you just couldn't get the guy to budge. It happens. But using a technique like this, you are less likely to offend. You are less likely to come across as aggressive. You are more likely to get the other person thinking your way.
That's right, it goes to risk, so the cost, there's risk. Scope three, yeah, well, or a lack of clarity. Yeah, or like.
And let me do that annoying thing where I,
Talk about something.
let me do that annoying thing when I answer a question with a question. What is proper UAT testing?
Some places it's just signing it off and saying, okay, go.
It can be.
Really,
But let's go back to our idea of a risk rating service. What is proper and thorough UAT for a piece of software that incredibly complex? Do you do every possible permutation? That's going to take several inconvenient forevers. Do you pull a subset of all the possible permutations? That will take much less time and open you up to much, much more risk of missing something. What's the right balance? Trust me, there's no answer to that question. Yes.
sorry. Oh, this man. When we go and create the requirements for it, we use a bunch of we don't do this exactly, but we do intent driven development. So make it very clear what we're building, write code last, not first. I make sure that every stakeholder signs off on what that requirement is. I point you to the requirements, saying, does this cover everything? Write your name down. This covers everything. I've talked with you. I've mocked it up. Here is what we're going to build. If it's in here, that's what you're gonna get. If it's not in here, it's in your head, you're not gonna get it. And that's the way it is. And invariably, yes, at the end, someone goes, well, you did blah. I'm like, side checked, you know how to read. You signed off, this is everything you want. I like this, the actually right there, you can signature. I write down who said, I checked this with so and so, yeah, or I make a note of it, send this date, or I sent an email, or well now, because we use Jira a lot, a couple of things to all app mention and say, please confirm this completely. Yeah. That's the CIA. Yeah, as well. The point is they'll come back going, you never told me. Here's the answer. CIA. Yeah, that's, and if you don't do that, then they're gonna be like, well, the developers just went off and did whatever they wanted to. And that's what happened.
Sure.
What do hospitals do when someone shows up and you can't identify them?
John Doe, Jane Doe. If there's a lot of them, Jane Doe number 2, Jane Doe number 3. Now they all have a identifier that goes with them to tie case to case. But since you need to put a name in there, Jane Doe until you find the correct name. Now that's a common process. I'm not going to swear to that being a universal process. But when I ask that question among people who actually do that sort of thing, that's one of the things that was said. Business knows what to do. Development follows the business.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. Any other questions? All over the place. So when we start here with the user interaction that we're modeling, breaking down is actually the term, a domain breakdown. I agree on that user interaction, that could be considered a feature. That could be considered a user story, but there is the umbrella item that needs to be tracked. When we get to over here, where we are looking through our flow of information. We have something saying, go do this, something saying, okay, I did this now. Now we have a good list of work items that go underneath that umbrella. And again, features and user stories and tasks, doesn't matter. But you know how to track work items for you. This isn't telling you how to do that. This is telling you, here is the complete and total list of work items that need to be done in order to finish this item here. Excuse me? Well, yeah, but I mean, that's what this process is about, though. You can obviously never eliminate them. And even if you do, how are you going to know you eliminated them? By their very nature, you can't. But if you go through this process, well, let's just say I've never gone through this process. Even in an example situation in a training class where we did a domain breakdown on ordering a pizza, I have never gone through this and not gone, huh, I didn't think of that. It's very common.
So you mentioned the tactical,
Strategic.
so I just wanted to clarify, is strategic all done up front? And then
No,
tactical
because you can't. So let me jump over here to Conway's law, and I touched on a little bit the concept of bounded contexts. When you start with strategic, what you're going to try and do is identify those bounded contexts up front. You may not know what all goes into them. You may know a lot of what goes into them. You're not going to know for sure until you get down to the tactical level. And again, this works very well. However, you need an organization that has the stamina and patience to spend that amount of upfront time. I've seen it done. I've seen it happen. It works very well. However, my assumption here is that nobody here is using domain-driven design at work. So I wanted to give a path here that will get you to the same place, and it absolutely will. But this way, you go through all of this for a single user interaction. You now have a backlog. People can look at that and say, yep, that's a backlog. Progress is being made. People can start, hang on, where's my mouse? People can start creating these classes. Okay, code's going into the repository. This is progress. And at some point, it goes out into production or into a dev environment or somewhere. And now people can say, yeah, things are happening. And while they're doing that, they're going, okay, and we're getting this big pile of documentation that is not useless, that tells us exactly what needs to happen, or if you're looking at it after the fact, exactly what has happened. You have the entire planning process right here documented. If somebody says, how did this get missed? You go back and say, well, it didn't come up. Okay, we'll go do that now. And we will update our documentation to have that in it. One customer, it took a year and a half, but we were deploying code the entire time because we started small. And that's the way I like to do it under almost all circumstances. There are people, very smart, capable people that I work with who disagree with me on that. It's one of the things I like about AIS. We have a lot of people who really know what they're doing, who talk about things in a different way, and there's a lot of collaboration like that. I like to do things this way when at all possible because it gets stuff out there quickly. Now, other people will say, how do you know that these bounded contexts are right? Well, because they looked right when I did them. And Other people might say, you're doing one interaction here, somebody else in a completely different application over there is doing an interaction that also uses, let's say, the risk rating BC. And the issue might come up, aren't you now creating this bounded context in two different places? Yeah, and people should communicate about that. And I will cop to the fact that that is a weakness in the way I like to do things. If you're dealing with a lot of different teams with work that isn't exactly overlapping, but has several touch points, you need tight communication. I'm a pretty big believer in tight communications in the enterprise. But if you're not in a situation where that's possible, for instance, significant development resources are offshore and you're just not awake at the same time, then maybe this is not the best way to go. There's no silver bullet. This is a way. And the only thing I can really say from here is if this seems to work for you, give it a shot. If it looks like that there are parts to this that aren't going to, go figure it out. Look something up. The only thing that I would recommend not doing is buying the domain-driven design blue book. It's $50 and it is the hardest read I have ever gone through. I'm in chapter 2 and it's been a slog. Don't get me wrong, good information in there, great book, but my goodness, is it difficult for me to read. So unless you really like to focus on dense walls of text, and that is not me, maybe you don't go do that. On the fly, making lots and lots of mistakes. Believe me, lots of mistakes. If I could go back to my first one, I would do it completely differently. But the second one was a little bit better. And after that, a little bit better than that. And I'm not claiming to be an expert. In fact, I'm claiming to not be an expert. I have an idea that I wanted to share. Maybe in 6 months, I come to the realization that most of this is a bad idea. Hey, who's to say? This is what I know right now, born of trial and lots of error. Yes. Whole nother path, which becomes easier to do because there's a lot of copying and pasting involved, which, as we all know, is the most important skill a software developer has in his arsenal. But it really is a different set of circumstances. Let's go back to just the business on this for a moment. If somebody is writing a loan and can't get that person's credit information, they have a process for that. That process is usually, okay, we're done here. But there's a process for that. But it is a different flow than when everything works properly. So it is, in essence, a different breakdown because it's a different interaction. But it's an easier one to diagram if you've done this first. No, I wouldn't go to that because that's not necessary. I would probably jump in here and remove one of these lines and say, okay, now what? This process has failed. What happens in the business when that happens? Probably the guy who came up initially with the idea of messaging, a guy by the name of Udi Dahan, has said there is no such thing as a race condition. There is only a business process you haven't sufficiently investigated. And I kind of like that because every question has the same answer. What does the business do? What they say, that's what you do. So remove one of these lines, this process has failed. Okay, underwriters, what happens when this process fails? Well, we go do this. Okay, great, that's what our software does now. Exactly our job. Our software should mirror the business.
Yeah, cut it to one more question. So I can stop the recording and let people go.
That's exactly what we've got here, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what you're talking about is a small piece of a whole. When you have vertical slicing, and going back to my last talk, highly cohesive software, then you also have highly granular software, which by its name implies small software. It's easier to estimate the work to be done on a small piece of software. It's borderline impossible to estimate accurately the work to do for an application. If you slice it up vertically into highly cohesive units, then they can be very concentrated, very focused, and therefore very small. And you can say, yeah, this web service is going to take me this amount of time to implement. And yes, somebody's going to try and pretend that you can add all of that up and get a schedule out of it. There's no real stopping that. Just be cautious doing that, because as you add more slices into it, the margin for error gets bigger and bigger. But it really comes down to estimating small things is easier than estimating big things. Sure,
Thanks.
not a problem.
Don't forget, it's recorded, so if anybody wants to watch it. I'll get out and look at it if I can.
Is it, will that die?
I'm.
Yeah.
This is not a slide deck, it's a lucid chart. So I could probably export it as PDFs